Is that okay? Can you all hear me? Okay. So being that I'm going first, I figured I would, I know that welcoming remarks were made early, but I did this 4 years ago and I continue to do it, so I'm going to do it. In 2008, I spent a great deal of time in Redfern, a largely Aboriginal neighborhood in Sydney, Australia, producing a project that involved Indigenous citizens and organizations from that community for the Biennale. I was struck by the overt racism in the city, the ongoing crimes against the displacement of Native Australians, now 239 years running. But there was something done as protocol that I felt kept the problems and failures visible and made them present, something I've tried to do in my own work for the past decade. In Australia, the acknowledgement of country is generally a statement or a speech made by an Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal to show respect to the traditional custodians of the land. I often believed that the best way to forget someone important is to name a building after them, so their name disappears into an address, into the architecture. I'm sure that similar things have been said about the acknowledgement of country, but as an outsider, I was incredibly moved when I heard this preamble spoken at every public speech. I thought about my own context as an American living on Indigenous land, taken from its original inhabitants. To live up to my commitment to the citizens of Redfern, I made a promise to myself that I would continue to remind those who had forgotten. Since my return to the US, I've begun all my public lectures with this, an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to the elders, both past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and hopes of a Native America. We must always remember that under the concrete and asphalt this land is, was, and always will be traditional Indigenous land. So a little bit about me. I'm from Great Neck, New York. It's a very affluent town on Long Island. The Iraqi Jews moved there in the 1940s and 50s, and then the Iranian Jews moved in 1979, and all the Iraqis moved out. So this is the way that it looks, very beautiful houses. This is 5 Gateway Drive. This is the house where F. Scott Fitzgerald lived from 1922 to 1924. It's where the Great Gatsby was seated. Great Neck was West Egg, and Sands Point was East Egg, so Great Neck and Manhasset. Also, resident of Great Neck, Andy Kaufman. Seriously, my mom used to point him out at Rosh Hashanah services at our synagogue. This is him reading The Great Gatsby from cover to cover as part of his performances in the late 70s and early 80s. This is a home that's available right now on a realtor site in Great Neck, Kings Point. That house is also juxtaposed here with a mansion of Saddam Hussein. So that's all I've got to say about myself. I went to art school, and I was a sculptor. And I was very disappointed with the idea that sculpture would end up in the gallery or in the display cases outside. And so I started to do something that I thought when I was a sophomore was kind of radical, which was, when an assignment in metal working class was given to do a wall relief, I made it look like the cinder block bricks in the hallway were growing, made them look exactly like the cinder block. Then I used to intervene in places like the light baffles that you can see in the previous photo. So I just installed my own cardboard version and made it look like a dynamic curve was cut into it. And then I started to do weirder things, but I was heavily influenced by Alan Wexler, who was teaching at Purchase at the time. SUNY Purchase is where I went to school. And this is one of his pieces from Katona in New York. You can see the furniture goes back inside these little storage areas. And then on the outside of the building, you have these beautiful, you see the negative space and the positive space, and it creates another seating area. So Alan was a really big influence on my work. This is another piece of his called Coffee Finds Its Own Level, where you have to sort of negotiate with everyone if you want to take a sip of the coffee. And he was a huge influence on me. He was the best teacher I've ever studied with and one of my favorite artists in the world. And it was his work that really opened up the place of gathering, of encounter, and also in particular the ritual of meals, which plays a role in my work, which we might talk about today. Then, influenced by Alan, I decided to design my own version of a dining table where the table would come out of the floor and the seating would come out of the walls. And then he told me that I really needed to do an internship with these guys. So this is, oh gosh, I don't know why that's blurry. This is Sight. This is Indeterminate Facade, which is even more indeterminate now that it's blurry. But I was an intern for them, and I was also their archivist for many years. I became very interested in their unbuilt projects. I was kind of amazed that their best buildings, which you've probably all seen in like architecture survey books, I was amazed that their projects actually got built, but what didn't get built was often the best ideas. And so this is High Rise of Homes, which is looking at these decrepit carcasses of buildings which can be reappropriated to sort of bring in these prefabricated suburban homes into the city. And then they go so far as to even do all the drawings that were required for it to be made. So then I started to do weirder things, like I said. This is matchbooks that I started to deconstruct, and I started to make these pop-up like Kenneth Snelson sculptures inside them. And I used to go to the smoke shops in White Plains and distribute them amongst functional matchbooks in these stores, like shop dropping, I guess. And I used to stand back and wait to see whatever reactions people would have. And then I did soda bottles. I think, Tom, you saw this stuff when I was at Skowhegan. Tom knows me from when I was 21 and I was doing really embarrassing work. I'm still doing embarrassing work, but I mean, now it goes even longer. So, you know, and also to kind of, you know, Tom will have a lot to say about this too, but I've been deeply influenced by what's been happening at the Queen's Museum over the past couple of years with Tanya Bruguera's Art Utile. And I figured I'd start this talk out by giving another talk. I was invited to be on a panel in Dubai in late March. And I was so infuriated by the questions that they sent me ahead of time that I just had to go and be a part of this. And the topic of the conference was, what does art do? And I felt like the questions that they gave us, the concerns for us to be drawn to, almost show the way that this practice, this thing we call social practice, and I'm not even sure that that's the right word, but it's the best we've got now. And it's embattled in a lot of ways. So some of the questions. What should art have to do? Why should art have to do anything at all? And moreover, in expecting to do so, are we not effectively territorializing the more radical elements of art as a practice? The fact that art does not have to have a function per se, and can thereafter realign that what can be said, seen, and heard about the very idea of functionality and use value. Sure, right. This is not a region-specific issue. It is arguable that art as a practice in, for example, Europe and North America, specifically collaborative and participative-based practices, is expected to perform the role of a quasi-social worker, or indeed educate a public about political and economic issues, or progress policies around inclusion and diversity. This process determines that art must have a meaning and a value that is quantifiable and ultimately reducible to the demands of politics, theory, economics, and weak versions of ethical discourse. To this end, art is usurped of the agency that enables it to potentially engage in a rethinking of what lies beyond the horizons of political, critical, economic, and social systems of meaning. The person who wrote this I like very much, but it's written from the standpoint of somebody who's quite invested in the market. And I'm not going to say that, you know, art is, you know, cannot be autonomous. I deeply believe in this. I believe in the ineffable. But I think we can all agree that there's a lot of different art worlds. There's a lot of different ways of making work. So I participated on this panel, which happened on March 18th, 2013. So I'm going to read it to you exactly as I read it to them. Good evening. It's nice to be here. It's not evening, right? I'm here to respond to the prompts for this conversation. What does art do, and should art do anything at all? I participate on this panel with some hesitation given the vagueness and open nature of this question. The simple answer to the first is many things, and to the second, no, it needn't. I do find it perhaps a bit disconcerting to be saying this, however, when this panel is happening on March 18, 2013, 10 years to the day after the beginning of the Iraq War. I think we all wish that art or anything could have done something that day to prevent the war and its aftermath from happening. There are many doings in art. Inducing a profound aesthetic experience is a doing, and a difficult one at that. But to speak more personally, I come to art from a background in design and architecture with their expectations of utility and function. Thus, in my work, doing has often been a critical moment. Art as shelter, art as para-archaeology, art as radical commercial enterprise. In each of these endeavors, however, I am also consciously constructing a kind of failure and critique of problematic mechanisms. Krzysztof Wodiczko calls this particular strategy, one we share, scandalizing functionalism. It names a place where problem solving is also trouble making. Useful art, or as Tanya Bruguera has termed it, arte utile, has a long and robust history. As Tanya notes on her 2011 website, the Useful Art Association, the Argentinian artist Eduardo Costa published a manifesto of useful art in 1969. In it, he describes a project in which he used his own money to replace missing street signs in New York City and to repaint the 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue subway stations, all to attack the myth that art lacks utility. Conversely, the rendering useless of useful objects, first seen in Duchamp's Ready-Mades, is a radical undoing. The spirit of Duchamp's reciprocal ready-made, in which he proposed using a Rembrandt as an ironing board, is revisited in one of Tanya's own works, taking up the claim that useful art needn't simply be the beautification of already useful things, we might better term this design or decoration, and that usefulness can be beautiful. Bruguera declared that the time had come to return Duchamp's urinal to the bathroom, and that's just what she did at the Queen's Museum of Art. And Tom, you presented this at Creative Times Summit, so I'm stealing from you. In Tanya's own words, you can go there, see it, and pee on it. As our host in Dubai alluded in his preliminary questions to this panel, art has become instrumentalized in institutions, and as we see right here and now, in the marketplace. Investment in an artwork is an investment, or more accurately, a gamble on an artist's future. How successful will that artist be? What will that artist do? And so I propose we turn the question around once more and ask, what do artists do and what should they do? I answer that what artists do is as important as what artists refuse to do. Take, for example, the commitment of many artists to the cultural boycott in the State of Israel, or the ongoing boycott by artists involved with Gulf labor against the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, refusing to lend works, accept commissions, or participate in anything sanctioned by that museum until fair labor conditions on Saadiyat Island are ensured, monitored, and enforced. Or to keep the conversation regional, the artists who still refuse to work with the Sharjah Art Foundation after the unceremonious, unfair, and injurious dismissal of former director Jack Persekian. But let me complicate this even more. I share the belief of Karolin Christov-Bakarjiev, the artistic director of Documenta 13, that we might see a day in the not-too-distant future when the word artist disappears. That's why the individuals and groups included in Documenta 13 were termed participants instead of artists. Indeed, there were artists, architects, urban planners, radical ecologists, feminists, scientists, anthropologists, poets, an art critic, and an unconscious analyst. There was also an assassin. Participant can be taken as an umbrella term, but for me, it evokes even more the possibility of an artistic practice dispersed across different disciplines. Much of the work I do aims to create a third way, to make problems visible, to interrupt silence, to present an impossible prototype showing how things could be. Most of these projects engage to one extent or another in real-life moments outside the gallery or museum context. I'm interested in work that does not become art too quickly, that can exist in the space of the real. Take, for instance, my favorite painting, one that I've come to call Orange. In November 2004, during the Orange Revolution, named for the color of the popular opposition, Natalia Dimitruk, the sign language interpreter for the Ukraine state television channel, was told to interpret the false announcement that Viktor Yanukovych was the winner of the widely contested presidential election. Instead, she tied an orange scarf to the inside of her sleeve, revealing it with every hand gesture, and deviated radically from the script of the live televised broadcast. A flash of orange. I am addressing everyone who is deaf in the Ukraine. Our president is Viktor Yushchenko. Another flash of orange. Do not trust the results of the Central Election Committee. They are all lies. A final flash of orange. I am very ashamed to translate such lies to you. Goodbye. You will probably never see me again. The ones to hear the truth were the first who could not hear. So when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a rock star. You know, I was the only person in high school, like 10 years after they broke up, that liked Wings, you know? And so here's me and my brother in our band from high school. We called ourselves Everest before the other Everest, named after the rumored last album of the Beatles, which was supposed to be called Everest. You know, I even have delusions of grandeur that you would need to go to get tickets to see this at levels of Great Neck. But you know, I've been giving these artist talks for many years, you know, and I sort of think about artist talks being kind of like the set list, you know, and I went around for a long time just kind of talking about the same stuff all the time. And I would see people that were in the audience at one lecture that suddenly showed up at the other, and I would go up to them and personally apologize to them and tell them, you might want to leave. I'm going to talk about the same stuff, you know, and it started to become really kind of disconcerting. So I started to think, you know, about those set lists. So this is a set list by a group called Hemorrhage. They're a gore grind band from Spain. This is their set list from Baltimore. One of my favorite musicians is Bruce Springsteen. He's famous for like having a different set list every night, you know, and he takes requests from the crowd, you know, and they hold up signs. So this is April 22nd, 2008, and it's very different from the set list on April 23rd, 2008. One of my other favorite musicians, Paul McCartney, the set list doesn't change from time to time, and they're note-perfect renditions of all of his hits. And that's Paul with his set list from 1964, and that's the last Beatles set list from Candlestick Park in 1966 that was on his Hofner bass until the mid-1990s. Another, my adopted rabbi, really, Leonard Cohen, set list from one gig in Boston in 2009. This one's from Portland, Oregon, the 8th of December, 2010. Sort of different and very different from his current tour, even though the opener is the same. I saw Elvis Costello on May 15th, or actually May 15th at the Chicago Theater. And Paul Simon was playing that same week, so it was a great gig. And Paul Simon talked about how it was great. He felt liberated that he didn't have to continue to play the boxer all the time. And so he's dropped a lot of his, like, you know, his mainstays in the set list and started to play deeper cuts. But then I saw Elvis Costello, and he resurrected this amazing thing that he had in the 1980s, which is the spinning songbook. You know, so there's a very beautiful woman who goes out in the crowd and asks people if they want to, like, you know, spin the wheel, and you know the set list is built in front of you. It's amazing. All right. So with thanks to Tanya Bruguera and thanks to Marcel Duchamp and Elvis Costello, I figured what we could do today is. All right. So who wants to spin this wheel? All right, wow, we have, okay, so I asked for a wireless mic, but I've got one that clips to my lapel, so you're gonna have to, come here. Oh, no, you can just speak into my collar. All
right, perfect. Do I need to say anything?
Well, who are you?
I'm Garrick.
And where are you from?
Portland.
And why are you here?
I'm here because I'm engaged at the conference, and I'm participating on, presenting on Sunday.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Let's see what we get.
That was kind of a weak.
Oh, my God. You're kidding me.
Parasite.
Allison. Okay. All right. Well. It's turning out to be the regular set list. It's not rigged, I promise. All right, where did my water go? Anyone? Oh, okay, great. All right, so this project began in grad school. And in grad school, I was in an architecture program that was that had a visual arts program within it. And I was reading in 1995, like any person who was a young architect at this time, City of Quartz by Mike Davis, which traces the evolution of Los Angeles into what he calls a fortress city. So I was very interested in the way that designers were being called on here. So you have the graphic designers invoking biblical prose, nonetheless, to create an anti-homeless ad campaign. Thou shalt not steal shopping carts. And then the first bum-proof bench appears in 1992 on the streets of Los Angeles. So it implicates the industrial designers as well. And so here you can see if you lie down on this bench, you'd simply roll off. So in 1997, I participated in an architectural residency in Kerak, Jordan. And while I was there, I did all my studies on the tents and the equipment of the Bedouin, the nomads of the desert. And one of the things that came across in this research was that the tents and the equipment were set up in ways that took into account the wind patterns that moved through the desert, so that it was a kind of like aerodynamics, so that the tent wouldn't collapse underneath the speed or the direction of the wind. I thought this was an amazing detail. It was a little bit like the aerodynamics of sailing, and I had no idea what I was going to do with this detail when I got back to the United States. And then when I was walking in Boston during the wintertime, I walked by this building on Tremont Avenue, and I saw a homeless person sleeping underneath this vent. And this wind that was being evacuated by the building was keeping this person warm for the night, potentially helping them survive. So the warm air, essentially was a wind, another kind of a wind, a juxtaposition of another wind, a wind that was a byproduct of a building's comfort system coming from the very thing that is absent from a homeless person's life, and also the juxtaposition of two different types of nomadism, those who are nomadic by tradition, vis-a-vis the Bedouin, and those who are nomadic by consequence, the urban nomads or homeless people. So the constellation that sort of happened in my mind was to harness this warm air to create these inflatable shelters for homeless people that would attach to the exterior ventilation ducts of a building's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. And so the project, so the warm air is actually circulating in between these two layers of plastic. So it's almost like putting an air mattress around you, so you never come into contact, or the homeless person never comes into contact with this potentially harmful air and heats through conduction. And so the project, like most projects in architecture school, begin as drawings for pinup. And these are particularly stupid drawings. I have no idea how a homeless person is going to gain roof access, and architects do a really good job of talking each other out of one another's projects, and so I left one particularly frustrating critique one day, and walking down Massachusetts Avenue, I came across a group of homeless men with whom I'd already been familiar. And I showed them these drawings, and I asked them if this was just academic bullshit or if this was something we could work on. And they said, well, come meet us tomorrow at the municipal shelter where we stay. We'll talk about it. And so the next day, an episode happens that I've come to call the conference room meeting, where there was a long table, an empty chair at one end, and 7 homeless men at the other, and they told me to sit at the other end. And it was very tense. All their arms were folded, and they started to, just kind of look down at the ground, and then finally someone said, so you're an architect? And I started to kind of fumble, and I was saying, well, I'm not an architect, I'm an artist who is working in an architecture program. And then they started to laugh, and they said, okay, well, if you're an artist, you're not so far from being like us. But if you were an architect, you would potentially be guilty of participating in a system that makes housing that we can't afford. And so with this new formed relation of trust, I guess, they came to my studio and saw the first prototypes that I was building, which involved black rubbish bags. And one of the homeless men, Bill Stone, said, well, why are you using black? And I said, I figured you'd want privacy. And he said, well, this is your first mistake, because we don't have privacy issues. We have security issues. We want to see potential attackers, and we want to be seen. So if we're going to participate in your strange project, you have the opportunity to move us out of the periphery of everyone's vision and move us into, the front. And so, for Bill, this was like Hannah Arendt. The visibility was somewhere on the way to equality. And so I was very, very heartened by this, and realized that my education at MIT was really beginning. And so this is Bill's shelter. He requested a shelter that was had as much visibility as possible, so he requested 6 windows that ran the circumference of the shelter, and if he was sitting up, and also if he's lying down. So it gives this kind of panoptical view to the outside. This is George Livingston's shelter. Each of these shelters, as Zach explained, was built on a material budget of $5 each, using weatherproof tape and rubbish bags. So it acts as a kind of agitational device for the passerby. So, they see these readily available situations on buildings and these readily available materials, and given the enormous number of homeless people that populate our cities, could we one day wake up and find these encampments taking over buildings like an ivy? George Livingston requested his shelter be make use of these things that he was calling air ribs. So it's like the structures in between the sort of A-frame here. And he made his very gastronomic connection to eating ribs. And he said, well, when you eat ribs, the meat's what's important. You throw away the bones. And so he said, I want to be the meat. So in between these semi-translucent pieces of plastic, there are these clear windows made out of Ziploc sandwich bags that allow for George to more or less regulate the levels of publicity and privacy when he's inside there. One day, Bill and George and a bunch of their friends came to my studio and said I had to come take pictures, that they found the vent that blows the hottest and the hardest in all of Boston and Cambridge. They actually started to map the city through hot air. And so this is the MIT Plasma Transfusion Laboratories, and they're able to get 2 shelters off the same vent. This is Bill on the left and George on the right in front of Bill's shelter. Bill on the left, George on the right, and in the middle is Freddie Flynn. And Freddie's responsible for the most complicated shelter I've had to build in the 17 years now that I've been doing this project. And I didn't know that Freddie was a science fiction fan, and he came to me and he said, Bill and George told me you'll build anything I want. And what I didn't know was that Freddie was an avid science fiction fan, and he came back with a torn out piece of a magazine that had the character Jabba the Hutt, and he said, I want to live in this. And so I sort of lived out a childhood fantasy of trying to sculpt Jabba with plastic bags and air, and he said I did an okay job. And so this is Michael McGee. The project moved to New York in 2000, where it was immediately contextualized with Giuliani's laws against the homeless. And Michael McGee is no longer homeless, actually, but at this time he was, and he was living in the area around Penn Station and Madison Square Garden. And he pointed to something that was written in the New York Times about the project, about how the project was in violation of the city's anti-camping laws. And he did research at the New York Public Library and found that the anti-camping laws are connected to anti-tent laws. And a tent, in the city's language, is defined as something that stands about 1 meter tall, domed, triangulated, whatever, capable of housing a person inside. And he started to wonder, what happens if we get rid of this bubble shape that seems to be so prevalent in all the other shelters? What if it's lower to the ground underneath this 1 meter measurement, and it's like a Simon Says game with the city? And so I thought this circumvention was brilliant. And so Michael's shelter is more like what he calls an inflatable sleeping bag, or a body extension, and it really does look like this body extension in this one image. And so here he is after the police have arrived and have more or less told us that we can take all the time we need to take all the pictures we want to. This one policeman came, and initially I thought my time was up. that they finally caught the bubble guy. And so instead he left us, and it was like this private revolution against Giuliani. And here Michael is engaging with people who've come out of the building to see what the fuss was about. And he's one of the most gregarious of the homeless people that I've ever worked with, carries around the articles of the project in the newspaper, and also my 72-page thesis from MIT, which he whips out for anybody who would stop. And so here you can see the inversion of the actors in the city as he gets Jane, who lives in the building, to get into the shelter and see the world from his point of view. And so, I continue to do this project, and so I end with this image. A project that was about architecture has suddenly become more about portraiture, as each homeless person is asking for the shelters to be made according to need and desire. And so this was a shelter that I built for Artie and his girlfriend, Myra. Artie was about 60 years old at the time. And he used to scalp tickets. He used to wait online for tickets outside of Madison Square Garden. And he asked for a bubble and then a low-lying area for him and Myra that he called the loving room. Okay, so we know what that is. And he requested black plastic for privacy. And about 10 days into making the shelter, he calls me up and he says, Michael, you've got to stop. You've got to stop. It's all wrong. And I asked, what was the problem? And he says, Myra talks way too much. So what we need are these two bubbles, these two sitting areas, and the loving room in between. So it should look like a bra or a dog bone. So in these spaces, in the margins of what's lacking, and in the margins of urgency, there's still desire, there's still humor. And so this project has kind of evolved since I started it in 1997 to also incorporate the how-to designs, the do-it-yourself designs that are often published in homeless magazines and newspapers around the world, along with an editorial about the project written from the perspective of a homeless person. So it distributes the skill sets back out into the populace that it's made for, but also distributes the conversation and the critique of the project. All right, so that's the end of that song. Who's next? Okay. In the back. Oh, okay, this is even better. So your name is Eric?
Yeah.
Okay. And you're from here?
Colorado.
Colorado.
Colorado Springs.
Yeah. All right. Nobody's clapping. Nobody's from Colorado.
With my crew in the back.
All right. Okay. So are you a student here?
I'm an alumni from Portland State.
From the PSU social practice program?
Yep.
How's life? Okay. All right. All right. So, okay. So let's spin the wheel.
All right. Did it make a full round?
Yeah. No, that's. Wait, do you want to spin it again?
No, let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. This is like a B-side. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Oh wait. Do you want something? Do you want? I have these prizes. This is cardamom from Iran. You can have that. There you go. So this is early work. Oh, there we go. Here we go. Wait, yes, this is it. This is like, yeah, this is the other wheel. We could just spin this. Okay, I think I've got it. Nope, wrong one. Sorry. Okay, hang on. Okay, So 129 Lafayette Street. 129 Lafayette Street is a building that's on the cusp of Little Italy and Chinatown. It's located at the really at the cross section of Lafayette and Canal. And in 2001, in August, this building was newly empty, vacated because the real estate company had nearly doubled the rent. So it was like a de facto eviction. It was a major hub for the Chinese community. It was a banquet hall. It housed a banquet hall, Chinese labor union offices, and dentist offices. The curators of this exhibition were each given a floor of the building with which to work, and the exhibition was staged to raise visibility of this vacant building for real estate purposes in the hopes that New York City's sort of fledgling Soho scene would stop moving out west to Chelsea and would move down south to Chinatown and essentially change the demographic and the value of the buildings. So I was invited by two curators to produce a new work that critically engaged with this, and so I had mixed emotions. I didn't want to do a work that would simply reinforce what the real estate company wanted to do, and wanted to see if I could create a Trojan horse. And so on my visit to the 9th floor gallery space, I smelt a kind of sweet smell. It was familiar, but also kind of foreign. And when I researched the context of the exhibition, I did a walk around the four sides of the building and on adjacent streets. And on Center Street, I came across Faidar Bakery. And it's located on the ground floor of an adjacent two-story building. It's at 191 Center Street, and the bakery is one of the most popular Chinese pastry shops, and also functions as a kind of like hangout joint for kids after school, and a place where people go at the end of like dates and dinners. And when I went into the restaurant or into the bakery, I spoke to some of the members of the Chinese community and asked them what they thought about this contemporary art exhibition that was happening, you know, essentially on their turf. And they were outraged that an exhibition that had nothing to do with their community was forcing their neighbors out, and didn't understand why this was something that they should be involved with. So mindful of this fissure between the neighborhood and the organizers of the exhibition, I wanted to bridge the gallery space with the bakery. And so I befriended the owner, who gave me a small tour of the bakery. It was a very small space, so there wasn't much to tour. And when I got to the back room, I saw the ovens. And over the ovens were these very large hoods that go quite a long ways into the back. And I realized the source of what it was that I was smelling on that 9th floor gallery space. And so I immediately had my idea. I went home and I did like the most absurd drawing that I've done, which was a proposal to extend their central oven duct up 125 feet so that it would go into the gallery space. And they immediately gave me the keys. So I used aluminum flexible duct. It was great. This piece could be seen from all parts of Lower Manhattan. And so for the duration of the exhibition, the 9th floor gallery space was filled with the smells of the Chinese pastries as they were being baked. So it breaches these fortresses of culture. And so at the opening, the bakery was so excited, they gave me like 600 pastries as a thank you for the free advertising. So people could actually eat what they were smelling. Doesn't have a happy ending, although none of the galleries ended up taking the bait and moving to this building. It changed hands to another realtor, and now it's high-end residency lofts. So gentrification happens in a lot of different ways, but you know, I don't know how much culture was part of it this time. Okay, so that's a short one. Okay. Oh my God. Hello? Okay. So, wow, only people, okay. So I know that you're from Colorado too, right? So we got to move it around. I see somebody up here. Yeah. Hi. Who are you?
Emilio.
Emilio. Okay. Are you from Portland?
Not, no.
Where from?
Um, Originally from Mexico City, but I live in Vancouver.
Fantastic. Is there a rivalry with Vancouver a little bit? Okay. This is really uninteresting. All right, so are you an artist?
I am, yeah.
Okay, and are you presenting at the conference? No. Okay, so maybe we'll get a chance to talk about your work throughout the weekend.
Sure.
With everybody. So, okay. All right. I've never talked about this piece. All right, thank you. Oh, do you want something? Hey, Emilio. This is Sumac from Chicago. Sorry. All right, so I've been nervous about presenting this piece for years because it's actually a very, very embattled piece for me. In 2008, like I said at the beginning of this talk, I was invited to produce a new piece in Australia for the Sydney Biennial. And it was actually curated by Carolyn Christobakarjiev, who I made reference to before. And actually, Carolyn was working at PS1 the same time that Tom was. And she gave me one of my first big projects in New York. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting about this conversation about institutions, I know we're talking about context, and we're talking about publics, but in terms of institutions, it's been really great to have these long sustained dialogues with people. And Carolyn is one of those curators who works in these really intense ways with artists and as a kind of interlocutor, as a friend, and as somebody who really is the advocate for the artist and their work. It's really quite special. So when she invited me to do something in Sydney in 2008, she invited me to come do a site visit, but it wasn't just any site visit. We went to Sydney, and we were there for maybe about 48 hours. And then we took a plane out to the Northern Territory, to the Aboriginal communities that produce the Aboriginal paintings that I think a lot of us might be familiar with. So this is us on a small plane flying over areas. This is in, I believe this is Yuendumu at the Art Center. That's Carolyn. There's Susan Phillips off on the right. Nicole Lascelles is standing next to the artist who's telling us the story of the painting. And the stories are basically these paintings that they're the dreaming stories, the sort of creation myths of the Aboriginal people. These paintings were usually done in the landscape or on the body, but in the 1970s, white Australians decided to put canvases in front of these Aboriginal painters, and it became a way for there to be kind of like this dual benefit of the communities where the art was being made to be able to afford money for the dialysis machines or the pools that they needed, or in the other case, the art dealers, of course, benefit. So it's a very, very fraught business that has some very seedy sides of it, and there's all these white gatekeepers to the kind of work that gets done there. And so, of course, like in connection to that one image I showed you of Qantas, like having this illustrated plane, it's almost as if, the indigenous community is the alien that's just landed in Australia in this photo. So I was simultaneously interested and infuriated in all of this. This is us flying over Uluru, and this is Carolyn in Kintori East, looking at one of the paintings. And the question of whether or not something ends up on the wall or on the floor, you might have seen, if you went to Documenta, the Japal Jara paintings were presented on the floor. William Stanner, an Australian anthropologist, said the words that gave me the name for this title of the project. And so I'll just read you the text in the drawing. According to Indigenous Australians, the world was created during the dream time, and their tribal dreaming stories explain how life, places, people, and animals came to be. Anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner popularized the term after an Aboriginal man told him, "White man got no dreaming." Bereft of dreaming, of the notion of timeless time and perpetual creation, white man has instead the great Australian silence, a disremembering of such injustices as the government policy of removing Aboriginal children from their families. So I became interested in how to bring some of this information out from what was going on in these, these distant territories and more to the center of Sydney. And what I found was really interesting was that in this, this neighborhood called Redfern, the Aboriginal Australians were tired of waiting for urban land rights from the Australian government, and so they just kind of said, screw it. They started to go to auctions for houses in the 1970s and started to buy these houses at auction. And until they had one house next to another house, next to another house, until they had an entire block of land, which ended up being almost like this island in the middle of the city, and it's called the Block. And in the October 1973 issue of Architecture in Australia, it was presented as a fairly radical project. It featured the proposal for Aboriginal housing in Redfern, the plan by architects Cole James and Richard Jermyn with Bob Bailliere. It included housing, renovation, the demolition of back fences to create a communal area, which if you can imagine in the 70s in the middle of Australia, in the central business district, is a pretty radical move. A clinic, a preschool run by Aboriginal mothers, youth trade workshops, and a cultural center. So this is the way that the local police interpreted that same housing scheme in very racist terms. It hung in the local detective's office, a harbinger of increasing persecution in the neighborhood. When Bob Bailliere arrived at the police station to help his wife Kay, who'd been arrested, her wedding ring was torn off and thrown at him because of his heritage. Koris, which is the term actually Aboriginal Australians prefer to refer themselves to, because the question of Indigenous Australian is starting to become muddied by people who are just born there, and they can consider themselves Indigenous. Koris were hauled from their homes, beaten, and charged with trespass on private property, their own. In the 1990s, drug-related crime led to 24-hour police harassment of residents, and by 2002, these efforts coincided with corporate ones to clear Aboriginals from the block in favor of private development when Redford teen TJ Hickey was fatally impaled on a fence after a police chase in February 2004. Long simmering racial tensions erupt in a riot. And so this is the Eluera Gym, which is, at this point, you can see this is the Aboriginal flag. This just gives you an idea of how run down these buildings have become. So there's kind of a chess match in the city about whether or not they can demolish things, because if they demolish these buildings, then it gives the green light for new Aboriginal housing plan to go to the city's offices, and that's like the biggest fear for the ministers of Waterloo and Redfern. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Also extreme amounts of homelessness and poverty. In 2004, Frank Sartor became Minister for Redfern Waterloo with extraordinary powers to redevelop the area by overriding local councils and heritage laws, facilitating private development and expropriating land. The block remains his key obstacle. Some in the government call it the blockage. Against him stands Aboriginal Housing Company Chief Executive Mickey Mundine, the brother of boxer Tony. The Aboriginal Housing Committee is not opposed to demolishing the block's decrepit English-style housing built in ignorance of climate and site, but believes it must remain a place for Indigenous living. Everybody knows that Redfern is Aboriginal people, Mundine explains. This is the main watering hole. We'll fight to the last to keep this land. And so with essential state subsidies cut off by Sartor, the Aboriginal Housing Company has pursued an independently funded $60 million redevelopment plan for the block, the Pemulwuy Project. Cracknell Lonergan Architects' sketch shows an Indigenous business college, hostel, gym, shops, art gallery, and 62 dwellings, the number of families in the local Gadigal clan before white settlers and smallpox arrived at their traditional waterhole in the 1790s. Pemulwuy, the project's namesake and the first Aboriginal freedom fighter, was beheaded in 1802 for resisting European settlement. So we decided to use my sculpture as the sculpture that I wanted to do for the biennial as an excuse to start demolishing the houses. And so these are the images that I sent by email to the folks that I was working with, pointing out all the stuff that I thought we could use to make my sculpture. So there are these funny like these little arrows. was like looking for the Photoshop key of how to make an arrow. So. And this is Peter Lucas, who's the most handsome man in Sydney. And he is his father, John Lucas, was actually trained by Buckminster Fuller and was the architect of the Murawina Women's Center, which actually ran a Breakfast Before Schools program that was based directly on the Black Panther program that happened out here on the West Coast. So there's these bridges between radicalisms. And so for me, it was very important that I work with people whose hands had something to do with the history of the site. So I was working with Peter as a fabricator, and then this is Peter Lonergan. There's a lot of Peters in Australia. So he is the architect of the proposed Pemulwuy project, and so he was involved in the design of what it was we wanted to do. And I keep showing you this building with the Aboriginal flag. So I said that that's the Eluera Tony Mundine Gym. This is Tony Mundine, the boxer from the late 60s. And this is the gym. It's become this really holistic place for youth development in the neighborhood. And so I decided that what I wanted to do in terms of a sculpture was to look at the way in which there was this impossible dream of building this Aboriginal housing in Australia in the middle of Sydney, and to think about this question of dreaming alongside the Aboriginal kind of terminology of what dreaming meant, but to look at visionary architecture as a kind of dream as well. That it's in the space of sort of pragmatism, there is this poetry, and it becomes this wish for something that kind of takes a critique of reality and demands a culture that will enable its existence. And so and they're often relegated to failures, to paper projects or to models. And so this is the very famous Tatlin model of the Monument to the Third International. And so I thought that this was like ground zero for anybody who's talking about visionary architecture. And so Tatlin designed the Monument to the Third International in 1919, 1920 as a memorial to the October Revolution. Believing art communicates through material, the 400-meter tall tower was to be built of industrial iron, glass, and steel. Within its spiral frameworks rotated three structures: a cubic meeting hall, a conic executive station, and a cylindrical radio broadcast center. A crowning dome housed a projector for casting propaganda across the clouds. But the tower was never built. It exists only in drawings and models, a visionary dream unrealized. So my idea was we would take these items that I highlighted in those photos and start to put them to use to make this Tatlin Tower. And so I did all this research on Vladimir Tatlin, and I came up with this factoid, or I found this factoid in Larissa Jadova's book on constructivism, that Tatlin was actually expelled from art school at the age of 17 and ended up joining traveling circuses as a boxer. It's a true story. And so when I told this to the Aboriginal community that I was working with, they saw this as like fate. They saw that this is the monument that we need. One of Australia's greatest boxing legends, Tony Mundine, lives in Redfern and manages Eluera Gym adjacent to the block. Founded in 1985, the gym provides mentorship and advice for Koori youth, in part about sporting success and the wide social acceptance and respect it can offer. Aboriginal boxers today get discovered in Mundine's gym, but they once relied on traveling tent boxing circuses where mostly Indigenous troops took on white locals. So one thing I'll say about my work is I actually believe that everything can be connected. I've done this long enough to know that there's always seems to be a primal scene that's waiting. It's one of the things that I've actually really grown to appreciate about not knowing where the work is going to go. Then you have other activists in Redfern in the early 70s, like Chica Dixon and the boxer Teddy Rainbow. And it's all these boxers, by the time that they get to becoming activists, they take their gloves off, they retire from the sport, and their fists are in the air in this kind of black power salute. So this is from the circus tent to the tent embassy that's still outside Canberra in Australia. So this is the tower being built. That's Peter again. And then 1 week before the biennial opened, we installed it for 1 week in the community center of Redfern so that the community could respond to it as opposed to just being the part of the biennial's open festivities. And so one of the things that happened in setting it up in this kind of duplex space was the kids went to the top of the landing and they called me up there and they told me, there's another great connection. All the wiring that was used to make the spirals was taken from the electrical wires in the houses, and the predominant colors were red, black, and yellow, which was the Aboriginal colors of the flag. But then when you look down on it, it resolved into a spiral, which for them was a demarcator of how you list a watering hole on those Aboriginal paintings. It becomes like a cartographic legend. So here it is in the Art Gallery of New South Wales in the main atrium. And around it, I should say this. At the very top of the tower, Corey Radio, the Aboriginal radio station in Sydney, installed its transmitter. So it was actually transmitting from the tower. So I'm able to realize one of Tatlin's dreams. And so these drawings that I just showed you, with more episodes that I can talk about now, are presented around it. And the last frame of the drawing left the story in a kind of cliffhanger. Applications for Pemulwuy were filed in fall 2007, burdened by superfluous requirements. The project remains a dream, its fate undecided. Mickey Mundine believes it holds a beautiful future for the Aboriginal people. His nephew, Anthony Chalk Mundine, puts it differently. The reigning WBA super middleweight world champion trains at his father's gym and is an icon for Indigenous youths throughout the country. He declares, if the Black don't stand, then Sartor don't stand. That's it. White man got no dreaming. And so I'm very rarely expecting these things to end up in the way I'm about to tell you. But when I did this project in 2008, it turned out it was an election year, and it actually caused quite a bit of fuss. White Australia kind of hated me. Whatever was left of the community at the block kind of hated me. And here I was able to go home. But the tower actually was able to create a discussion, and it ended up in the press. And finally, the person who was running for the Ministry of Waterloo and Redfern and the mayor who was running for office made concessions to the Aboriginal Housing Company and said that if they got elected, they would get their housing. So they ended up getting elected. And the Aboriginal community has their housing being built right now. And what's been nice in sharing the story of this sculpture is that this kind of pathetic sculpture has played one of those roles in essentially getting the housing there. So, Tatlin's symbol sometimes seems dead, but there's ways of resuscitating these emblems and putting them to use and leveraging them in the world. So that's that. That was the first time. Okay, there's somebody who's locked over there who probably hasn't even seen a thing. Okay, so this is the last one. Sorry, we're getting somebody from the margins. Hello.
Hi.
What's your name?
My name's Heather Lindahl.
All right, and you're from here?
I'm from Chicago.
Ah, okay. From me too. Great. Anybody else from Chicago? All right. Okay. Woo, yeah. And are you presenting?
Yeah, with Lucky Pierre.
Oh, great. I like Lucky Pierre a lot. Remember when? Oh. That's nice. Okay, so let's spin it.
Okay.
Aha! All right, this is a good one to end with, I guess. Spoils. Oh, you know what you can have, actually? This one's really good. This is an Iraqi date seed. I ate it, though, so it has my stuff on it. All right. It was before I got the cold, so don't worry. All right. Okay. That's a nice image, no? All right, so these images are from April 2003. I show these images a lot. It's the Iraq Museum after it was looted after the American invasion. And so what you see is an emptied out museum, destroyed artifacts, broken vitrines, and I based an entire work about this that's ongoing called The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, which involves the scale reconstructions of any items that are still believed to be missing, stolen, destroyed, or whose statuses are just still unknown. And as a result of this project, I started to do research on where these things ended up in the aftermath of the looting. A lot of stuff had actually ended up on eBay. And so I started to frequent eBay quite a lot. I'm like a big eBay guy. And I have a sort of an alert word for Iraq. So whenever something from Iraq shows up on eBay, I get a little alert, and I go, and so I get like a lot of emails a day from eBay. And one day I got this email, and I kind of couldn't believe it. It's 2 Star Wars references and 1 artist talk. How good is that? So I found this helmet online that was called the Iraqi Fedayeen Darth Vader War Helmet Special Forces. And it turned out that the Fedayeen Saddam was actually ruled by Uday Hussein. As of 1995, he presided over them. And they were the sort of paramilitary battalions that reported directly to Saddam and not to the rest of the Iraqi military. And Saddam and Uday were huge Star Wars fans. And so they decided to model the costumes of the Fedayeen Saddam after Darth Vader, after the famous Star Wars villain. And so here you see they're actually cast directly from these costume helmets. And it's not ballistic proof. They're actually the same fiberglass that you find on Charles Eames chairs. So it's essentially a kind of dress-up, which is really interesting from an anthropological point of view, that like it happens in 1995 after the first Gulf War, after Iraq sort of falls away as a de facto ally of the United States, and it's almost like, this is what you think of us, we'll wear the costume. So I'm not going to really talk about this. For better or for worse, I dedicated a whole show at the tape to this. But here you just kind of see all the juxtapositions that are being made, and not an ounce of fiction, unfortunately. Shortly before the Iraq Museum was looted, on April 9th, 2003, the Saddam statue in Firdos Square was pulled down. Shortly after that, the shock and awe campaign began, and Saddam's palaces were destroyed, and they were ransacked by local Iraqis. Here you see an Iraqi man taking plates, and it turned out that the chandeliers, the plates, the chairs were used by Iraqis as everyday objects in their houses. And so I'd like to see it as a kind of dispersal of the symbols of power. Also on eBay, I found that I could get Saddam's silverware. And so when Creative Time invited me to think of a project to do in collaboration with the restaurant Park Avenue up on 63rd Street and Park Avenue, I started to think, about what it is that I might be able to do to kind of bring these objects into play. So to think about the minor object, but to also talk about what are all the other artifacts that aren't being talked about that are still being sold on eBay and places like that. So after I talked to the chief chef about making a dish that would involve Iraqi date syrup and be able to kind of tell people something on the menu about where it was from, like these high-end restaurants, they list where your arugula is from, where your meat comes from, and it's supposed to make the diner feel good. I was interested in making the diner feel bad. So if it says Iraqi date syrup, which, you know, the provenance of date syrup is often covered up by saying that it's a product of Lebanon or some other third-party country, then that would be one way of intervening. And so the chef said, done. You know, I'm going to make this date syrup with tahini, and I'm going to put a venison chop on top of it. So it's like the Iraqi date harvest meets the American deer hunt. And then I said that the next thing I wanted to do was to then purchase 20 of these plates that belonged to Saddam Hussein that I suddenly found available on eBay from 2 different sellers. One was an American soldier who was based in Baghdad, and these plates were actually sold to American troops on bazaars that were vetted by the armed forces. And the other person who provided the plates was an Iraqi refugee living in Detroit, Michigan, whose father used to be a high-ranking officer in the Iraqi military. So by getting these plates and putting them into use, the diner is forced to kind of make a decision about whether or not they can eat the food. You know, it creates this dynamic kind of triangle of tension between the diner's tongue, the same way Zach was talking about, the diner's tongue, the sweetness of the date syrup, but then the bitterness of the provenance of the plates. And it's a double provenance, you know, not just that they belong to Saddam Hussein, but to think about the conditions through which they were brought to your table through conquest and through empire. It turned out that Saddam himself was also a looter. Some of the plates that we got was actually the plates of the executed ruler, the monarch King Faisal II of Iraq, who was killed in 1958. And Saddam was a real sort of, he had a very sort of, what would you call it, a kind of morbid fascination with the history of the Iraqi king. So it's like, you know, big fish eats littler fish, eats littler fish. So these were found in Saddam's cabinets as well. So we had some of these plates. And so these are 2 Kuwaitis eating the meal who said that they found it to be a very healing gesture. But in as much as the project is about consumption, it's just as much about refusal of not being able to kind of participate. And then this is how my work gets reviewed these days, you know? So the New York Post, you know, Saddam does the dishes. And it turned out that this kind of press was caught the attention of the State Department. So the State Department finds these articles, and they issue a cease and desist 2 days before the project was about to end. So it's like, you know, when Microsoft Word quits on you after you've saved everything, it's sort of like, what's the big deal? That was probably a really bad reference. So what ended up happening was they sent these emails around that demanded the surrender of the Iraqi plates that belonged to Saddam Hussein. It's like this was the exact language in the emails, so they demanded the surrender even of the inanimate objects. And so at Creative Time, these 2 U.S. Marshals show up in December of 2011, and they start to collect, you know, these are marshals from forfeiture and assets, and they're verifying that these are the plates. That's somebody from Creative Time, and what was her name? Katie from Creative Time in the background there. He's making sure that it is Limoges. And then this is the repatriation that happened at the Iraqi mission to the UN right afterwards. I went uninvited, followed the detectives in their car and showed up at the Iraqi embassy. And they told me, that they thanked me for cooperating, and they said that these plates were going to end up in Saddam's palaces, which are being opened up to the Iraqi people to show the way that he lived. And that the project in New York was going to be listed as part of the history of the work, which I still can't quite believe, but I think they were trying to make me feel important. And so what I found very interesting was that as Americans and Iraqis and their Iraqi counterparts went around with reckless abandon looking for symbols of the Saddam regime to destroy, the order came directly from Washington, from Obama's office, while the Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was in town, to return these symbols of Saddam's regime to Iraq. And it was that Thursday, after the plates had been repatriated and flown on the private plane of the Iraqi Prime Minister back to Baghdad, that the Iraq War was declared over. So I'm going to end with a very, very short video. I promise it's very short. That just kind of shows the way that it got contextualized here in the States. So let's see. What I heard was that the plates were a gift. Sorry. I'm a little in shock. Oh, well. State presence. I mean, these people walking in and out of the room, opening the door, shutting the door. It was like a striptease. And then, they let us into the room and we had this very frank discussion about the plates, and they were very happy to receive them back and said that they were part of their cultural heritage. So I'm a little in shock. Pretty incredible.
Best new thing in the world today is obviously the end of the Iraq War. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta saying today in Baghdad that Iraq is now fully responsible for directing its own path. The war ending as it should. Iraq now becoming its own sovereign country without our flag flying over it anywhere, without our troops anywhere in it. That's easily the best new thing in the world, maybe this decade. But there's another Iraq story that is ending as it should. It doesn't beat the end of the war, but it's pretty good. This fall, a Chicago-based artist got together with a New York City arts group and a restaurant. They put together an ambitious, big-thinking art project. They found on eBay dinner plates believed to have been looted from Saddam Hussein's palaces after the U.S. invasion. They bought the plates, and as an interactive art installation, they served on Saddam's flatware and plates venison with tahini and date syrup and pomegranates. The project was called Spoils. The artist said he wanted diners to think about how the plates got to their table. Quote, "This is about the symbols of power in that regime that have now come into the ownership of the populace that were living under Hussein," he told the New York Times last month. But you can't just buy Saddam's dinner plates on eBay. Not legally, anyway. When the art group was formally notified that the plates really belonged to the Iraqi people and needed to be returned, they agreed to give them up. So earlier this week, in what the New York Times described as a strange but cordial visit, the artist helped the U.S. Marshals pack up the plates so they could be delivered to the Iraqi mission at the UN. By Tuesday afternoon, the plates had made their way to D.C., where Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was in town to meet with President Obama. The plates were then scheduled to fly back to Iraq with Maliki on his private plane on Wednesday, which is to say this ambitious, big-thinking art project ended as it should have. The Iraq war is over. Iraq is a sovereign nation. And one of the very small things that means is that they get their stuff back, too.
Thank you very much.